who may not know, the Lumen Lecture Series is put on by the chaplain's office, and it invites leading scholars to campus to discuss the Christian faith and their academic disciplines. We are expecting this lecture to go to about 8:15. We'll have a Q&A portion after the lecture, so if you have questions for Dr. Case, you can scan the QR code that will be on the slides. 2 more reminders: this lecture is being recorded, so and posted on our YouTube page. And then please silence or put away all your cell phones and devices, and because we want to give our guest speaker our full attention. With that being said, I would like to begin with this quote from theologian Thomas Aquinas. "Man cannot live without joy. Therefore, when he is deprived of true spiritual joys, it is necessary that he become addicted to carnal pleasures." This quote beautifully captures the heart of what we are here to consider today, the question of what it truly means to flourish. If human beings were wired for joy, then the real challenge is not whether we will seek it, but where we will seek it. I have the great privilege of welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Brendan Case. Dr. Case serves as the Associate Director for the programs at Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University, and his work explores the intersection of Christian ethics, virtue, and the question of what it means for individuals and communities to live well. Drawing from theology, philosophy, and social science, he invites us to think more deeply about happiness and the meaning in life that does not just lead to success, but also to wholeness. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Brendan Case.
Is this on now? Wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to thank Dr. Huggins for his kind hospitality, for the whole chaplain's office. You guys have been absolutely wonderful today. It's been such a joy to get to know you and other new friends from the Barrie community, and I'm so grateful for so many of you coming out. I have to say, theologians typically speak to much smaller audiences than this, so I'm just deeply gratified and honored by your presence and by your kind attention. Honestly, I'm deeply grateful to be anywhere besides Boston tonight, which is being absolutely inundated with snow as we speak. I was hoping to enjoy a little more southern warmth, when I got off the plane than I did, but I seem to have brought the cold weather with me, so apologies for that. As Ellie mentioned, I am Brendan Case. I'm the Associate Director for Research of a group called the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. We study the nature and the distribution and the determinants of a good life in a very broad sense. I'm going to tell you in the first part of my lecture about some of the work that we've done over the last few years of the program to try to understand the shape of a good life today, where it's to be found, what are some of the challenges that we're facing in our pursuit of flourishing, and then I want to conclude in a more theological vein by thinking together about what it is about the nature of the world that makes the good life take the shape that it does. And the through line through this lecture really is that love is the essence of a flourishing life, ultimately because God is love. And the quotation there at the top of my title, "The All-Glorious Way of Charity," is taken from sort of the hero of the lecture at the end, a great theologian named Maximus the Confessor, who lived a very long time ago but was a very, very wise and holy man. And before I go on, I want to just flag this photograph on the opening slide, which I put there mostly because I wanted you to have something nice to look at before I got up here. But it does really beautifully capture, I think it goes right to the heart of my remarks tonight. It's a casting which sits on a patio at Duke Divinity School, where I was a graduate student. And it is a piece by a woman named Margaret Parker titled "Reconciliation." And this is a depiction of the moment at which the prodigal son, who's kneeling from Jesus' parable, has reconciled with his father, but is still estranged from his older brother, who, as you remember in the story, was very upset that the younger wayward brother, got special treatment when he came home after being away for such a long time. And the father is entreating the brother to come, turn back, to be reconciled to them, to forgive, and to embrace love again. And so that's where I want to end. I want to end with forgiveness and sort of the challenge of love. But let me start let's take a step back, and I want to reflect for a few minutes on what we mean by human flourishing. This expression is probably new to many of you. Flourishing is not a word that, unless you're working in, like the agricultural sciences, which I gather some of you in fact are, you're probably not using a lot in your day-to-day life. But it's a word which we at the Human Flourishing Program, and many others in the well-being science sort of world, think is a useful way of encapsulating what a good life consists in. Okay, so what is a flourishing life? Well, the definition, the sort of working definition that we at the Human Flourishing Program use as a way into this question is on the left-hand side of the screen. So a flourishing life is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives. This is a deliberate, you probably noticed, this is quite a broad definition, maybe unhelpfully broad definition of what a good life consists in. A state in which all aspects of your life are good covers literally every aspect of your life. Anything that could be going well in your life needs to be going well if you're to flourish. We think that this broad definition is helpful, though, because there is an unhelpful tendency in many corners of the social sciences to sort of home in prematurely on a few undeniably important but very limited aspects of a good life. So there's a lot of energy and interest within certain sectors of psychology, for instance, in positive emotions. How can we have more joy, more happiness, less anxiety, less sadness in our life? Super, super important. Don't mean to deny that that's important. The field of economics is very interested in how we can be materially prosperous, how our lives can be characterized by abundance, by plenty, the way that can translate into greater health and longevity for us. All of that matters, there's no question those are all important dimensions of a flourishing life. And they're reflected in this diagram on the right-hand side of the screen. You see happiness and life satisfaction, this sort of a life that feels good, is one of the aspects of a flourishing life that we think is important to both to study and assess and try to understand. We also do important work on physical and mental health. We do work on financial and material stability. We also think it's important to think about other easier to neglect aspects of a flourishing life. Aspects like meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close relationships. A good life is not just a life that feels good. It's not just a life that's characterized by abundance, a life of plenty, a prosperous life. Those things matter, but they really matter for the ways in which they can, and they only matter to the extent that they translate into deep, loving relationships, a sense of transcendent meaning that goes beyond, your sort of momentary pleasure or narrow self-interest. And ultimately, and we think, in the most fundamental sense, a good life, a good life ultimately is a life that consists of being, and even more importantly, becoming a certain kind of person. A good life is not just a life that's characterized by lots of good feelings. It's not even characterized necessarily by having a deep sense of transcendent purpose and pursuing that relentlessly. Lots of people who are pursuing really terrible ends in the world have a profound sense of transcendent purpose. People who are part of terrorist groups, for instance, right, have a deep, deep sense of calling and mission that shapes their life in the world. All of those things, all of those aspects of our lives are good for us to the extent that they flow from being a certain kind of person. The classical philosophical tradition talks about this in terms of the cultivation of certain virtues. Virtues like justice, wisdom, temperance, prudence, and there's a whole cloud of other virtues that cluster around those. But they're all ways of talking about the life of a person which is sort of fundamentally oriented towards goodness. Not towards what's pleasant, not towards what's useful to them in the moment, but to the good for its own sake. A life that is deeply grounded in the pursuit of what is ultimately good with a capital G. And for Christians, of course, that in the final analysis is God. A flourishing life is one which is oriented, even if not always under that description, even if we're not always calling him by name, toward the pursuit of the God who made us. So we highlight these 5 or 6 dimensions of a flourishing life as important aspects of a good life that we think it's useful to home in on because almost everyone agrees that these matter. Now, there's some aspects of a good life which seem to me very important, which we don't capture in this diagram. They're not part of our kind of core research program in the human flourishing program. Experiences of beauty, might be on the list, are not directly captured here. Another very important one, which I've already mentioned, is the pursuit of, you might think of spiritual well-being, right? The pursuit of salvation, of being known by God, characterized differently in other religious traditions, the pursuit of nirvana, say, for Buddhists. We don't include it in this sort of core schema, mostly because, unfortunately, there's just very wide disagreement about how to characterize that aspect of our lives in ways that there aren't necessarily about happiness, say, or meaning as a good. So we don't mean this list to be exhaustive. We think that these are 5, and including financial material stability, 6 aspects of a good life, which almost everyone agrees matters. And what we do in our empirical work at the Human Flourishing Program is try to understand the ways in which these 4 communities, principally, these 4 kind of core pathways, can help individuals who move through them to flourish. So our empirical work at the program is not exclusively, but very heavily focused on the ways in which belonging in family and in marriage, participating in religious communities, participating and moving through educational institutions like the one we're sitting in tonight, and workplaces facilitates a life of flourishing for those who enter into them. And the point is not that no other communities matter, or that no other practices matter. If you have any exposure to sort of the world of positive psychology or well-being science, you probably have heard about a variety of practices, life hacks, which can be valuable for people who engage in them. You might think about, you maybe heard about gratitude journaling, say, or mindfulness practice, meditation practices. We actually do some work as a program on these kinds of topics, and there's a lot of evidence that they do matter. They're helpful for many people who engage in them. But what we find is that on average, the difference that they make in the lives of the people who engage in them, the difference, say, gratitude journaling or mindfulness practice makes in the lives of people who engage in them, really pale in comparison to the sort of transformative effects of participating over the long term in religious communities, in marriage and family, or education and workplaces. These are sort of encompassing, load-bearing institutions in the lives of almost everyone in a way that is just not true for one-off practices like meditation, or even other kinds of community. Maybe you were part of the Boy Scouts as a kid, or maybe you are part of a stamp collecting club, or whatever your thing is. That might be enormously transformative for you, deeply, deeply impactful on your life. But in terms of what touches the lives of humans across time and place, we find that these 4 communities are arguably the most important on average. So let me tell you a little bit about the kinds of things you can learn if you have the right data about these aspects of life. So essentially what we do as a program, we here, meaning the whole community of scholars who are part of our team at the Human Flourishing Program. So that includes epidemiologists and psychologists and sociologists. It also includes humanists like me, so I'm a theologian by training. We have philosophers on our program staff. We have historians and bioethicists, and we all come together at the program to try to pool our collective wisdom, essentially, to get a grip on this thing called flourishing. What is it to have a good life? How can we have that today? And if you look at our sort of publications, the academic papers that we publish at the program, a lot of them use data collected on people going about their ordinary lives over a period of decades. So there's a group of 90,000 nurses that a team at Harvard University has been checking in on every 4 years for about 40 years. And they're asked a ton of questions about their lives, a bunch of questions about their health. The study notes if they get sick or even if they die. And we have data from that study about their experiences of marriage, about their religious identity and practices, about many, many aspects of their lives. And there's a number of studies like that have been tracking large groups of people over a period of decades. And you can use those data to essentially try to understand the way that something like the decision to get married or the decision to attend religious services weekly affects your life over a period of many, many years. So in one paper that my colleague Ying Chen led a few years ago, she found that if you distinguish between, if you break this group of 90,000 nurses in the mid-90s into those who had ever gotten married and those who had never gotten married by about age 40, and then track them for 25 years, what you find is that the group that was, that the married group had about a 35% reduction in death for any reason, after controlling for absolutely every other difference that you could imagine. Right? So all underlying health factors, behavioral differences. And one thing that's really cool about this study in particular is that it's an attempt to answer a very common and very reasonable objection to research on marriage, which is that if you're comparing people who happen to be married to people who happen not to be married, right? So who are single, never married, or divorced, or widowed, you're effectively comparing, in the case of the still married folks, good marriages to marriages that have not gone so well for a variety of reasons, right? So, marriage is a risk factor for divorce. You can't get divorced or become widowed unless you get married. So maybe all things considered, if you actually were considering, the risks of marriage, maybe it's not such a good deal. So our study was designed to sort of factor in those risks. So even accounting for the risk that you'll end up getting divorced, that you'll end up being widowed, we still find very, very profound effects of promoting flourishing among the married cohort. And we find there's similar, this second paper that I reference here is not one of ours. It's a meta-analysis, a big study of many, many previous studies, well-designed studies, looking at the effects of marriage on men in particular. And this meta-analysis also found that it's very similar effects of marriage on the health of men in particular. So it is a powerful institution which facilitates many aspects of flourishing for on average, for those who participate in it. And one thing that's a little funny, I'm always a little hesitant about sharing this detail with younger crowds because I don't want to scare you off from getting married. But there's a very strong, there's a lot of debate about what are the mechanisms here. Like why does marriage affect people in the way that it seems to? And there's not a straightforward answer here, right? I mean, marriage is probably our species' oldest institution. Pretty much every society has some version of it, and that's probably for a reason, right? I mean, it seems to fit, in important ways with the kind of animal we are. For men in particular, one of the things that happens typically after men get married, and especially after they have their first kid, is that their testosterone levels drop significantly. Now, this is kind of a bummer. Both for I'm married, I have 5 kids, so you can imagine how I received this news when I first read about it. But it's very important. It's very important for the way that it shapes the lives of men because testosterone, while it is a cool hormone and it's good for lots and lots of things in the lives of all humans, but especially men, is also a hormone that promotes at high levels all kinds of risky and potentially self-destructive behaviors. So it's not an accident that young men, especially young unmarried men, tend to be the people you see driving fast cars, staying out too late, consuming too many exciting, intoxicating substances, jumping off of tall things, right? And it turns out that having a wife and kids who are, wondering where you are, having a job you have to show up for the next day, right, is a very strong disincentive to those kinds of behaviors. And it's a big explanation, probably, of why married men are less likely to die over any, particular period of time than the unmarried. We've also done on the right, there's this nice graphic that a group at Christianity Today did for an article that I wrote with a colleague a couple of years ago about our program's work on religious service attendance. This is another, as I said, major area of work for us. What happens on average in the lives of people who attend religious services on a regular basis? And so this chart is summarizing evidence from a bunch of different studies. We've published a number of papers on this topic. And so, we find that on average, For instance, regular religious service attenders have about a 50% reduced risk of divorce compared to those who never attend. They have a 30% lower risk of depression. They have a very, very large reduction in the risk of suicide, about a 5-fold reduction in the risk of committing suicide. The one really misleading stat, unfortunately, on this chart, which I have to apologize for, I did not notice this until after the article was published, although now I will never change it because it's just hilarious to me. The graphic designer who made this graphic claimed on our behalf that our research shows that attending religious services every week reduces your risk of death by 33%. Now, I'm sorry to tell you that no matter how many religious services you attend, your risk of dying at some point remains very high, right? I mean, it's 1, right? You're going to die at some point, right? So, but your risk of dying in the next decade, right, or in the next 25 years can, in fact, be reduced substantially by about 33% if you attend religious services every week. That's remarkable. And again, this is controlling for all of the differences that we can think of, between these two groups, right? So again, it's natural to ask the question, why? Why do religious communities seem to shape the flourishing of people who participate in them so profoundly? And again, as with marriage, there's no simple answer to this question. Religion, along with marriage, is our sort of second oldest institution as a species. Again, very, very widespread in the anthropological record. Most societies have some version of it. There's probably a reason for that. One very common explanation for why religious communities are so important for the lives of those who participate in them, like among social scientists today, is social connection. That it's a source of community. It's a place to go get friends. It's a place to have social support. If you're in need, if you lose your job, someone can, your community can help you out. They can help you find another job. If you need to move, you have friends who can help you move. All of that's plausible, and that's definitely an important factor, right, in why religious communities matter in the way they do. But there are actually a range of other mechanisms that are almost certainly a range of other sort of drivers of these effects of religious community on people's flourishing, which you're not likely to find by going to the Rotary Club, say, or joining a bowling league, looking for community in other settings. So, religious communities offer, for many people who participate in them, a deep sense of transcendent meaning, right? You show up to a place and are told and come to believe that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. That's not something you get in most other communities, right? Religious communities also reinforce important norms about how you should live, right? There's some of our research suggests that a non-trivial part, a significant part of that effect on suicide in particular, reducing the risk of suicide, comes not just from the fact that religiously observant people are less lonely, say, and so less depressed than those who are not observant, but also from the fact that religiously observant people are more likely to believe that it would just be wrong to take their lives, right? So those norms, the moral norms, matter as well. I've mentioned 3 potential factors. There's many others, almost certainly, right? These are complicated institutions. They're complicated because no one designed them, right? They've grown up with us over time, and they're fitted to the kind of thing we are. Broadly speaking, we've also done work as a group on larger, more general questions about what happens to people when they become socially isolated or lonely. Not surprisingly, nothing good. The stat I cite on this slide is based on a study of retirees, a longitudinal study called the Health and Retirement Study. So only, I think, people aged 55 and up. But in that study, the most isolated demographic, and this is a study, it's worth saying, of the most isolated demographic, socially isolated demographic in our country. Our older people, they're much more likely to live alone than younger people. The most isolated group were about 74% more likely to die over the 5 years of follow-up, 4 years of follow-up, than those who were less isolated. Now, it's common to sort of run together loneliness and isolation in discussions today about the sort of epidemic, that we are arguably facing in this country and across much of the West. There are good reasons to do that. They do tend to go together. If you are socially isolated, you're more likely to feel lonely. But they also come apart, and they affect us in different ways. And it's actually it's interesting to analyze them separately. Loneliness is a psychological phenomenon. It's feeling as though your social network is inadequate. It's feeling as wishing that you had more friends, right? You can be surrounded by people but feel very lonely if you don't feel sufficiently connected to them, if you feel estranged, say, from people in your network. And you can actually be isolated and not feel lonely. Hermits in the desert. You can spend years often not talking to anyone else. And in many cases, report feeling deeply connected to God, to the wider church through prayer. Isolation turns out to be very dangerous, not only because it's a risk factor for depression, say, because you feel lonely, but also because, say, if you have a heart attack and you live alone, there's no one to call the police, right? There's no one to call an ambulance to come get you. You're more likely to die if you fall and hit your head, right? And so these are, they're independently risky. The risks go together. And the next couple of slides are sort of a bummer, I apologize, but I've talked, in the last slide about the importance of these institutions, marriage, religious community, the sort of broader phenomenon of being connected to others. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, this is just from this country, okay? And I know it's a little hard to read. Graph starts in the 1990s, which is, it's worth saying, was a period in which marriage rates had already been falling quite precipitously for about 30 years in this country, and they've dropped by they've roughly halved, since marriage rates have since 1990. Very similar trends for religious service attendants. Again, this only goes back to 2000, but in the year 2000, you see the blue line at the top is weekly service attenders. About 33%, about a third of Americans attended religious services at least weekly. In the year 2000, that figure had fallen by about 50% as of, I think this goes to 2022. Happily, the bleeding seems to have stopped somewhat in the interim. At the latest data, which I don't have reflected in this graph, as of 2025, is that religious service attendance seems to be holding steady for the moment at about 20%, which still puts America way above most of Western Europe, for instance, in terms of participation. Where in Sweden, it's about 4%, say, of people who are attending services every week, but still massive declines, right? In marriage and in religious community, these are enormously impactful institutions, as I've just indicated, in the lives of people who participate in them. And some of the work we've done in our program suggests, for instance, that about 40% of the increase in suicide in this country, which has been enormous over the last 20 years, is attributable in part to declines in religious service attendance. 40%, I mean, I don't actually know what the raw figure is, what the absolute figure is, but it's hundreds of thousands of people who would probably still be alive today if not for those declines. That doesn't mean that religious service attendance was the only factor that mattered in their lives. Often this is a complicated spiral of events that lead someone, losing a job, losing a marriage, dropping out of lots of communities, descending slowly over time into substance abuse, right? You see how that goes. But, religious communities are one place where people can be sort of rescued from those destructive spirals. And a lot of people are dropping out of those communities and seeing their lives suffer as a result. And then just more broadly, this is the place I wanted to end with the trends. This is taken from the Surgeon General's 2023 Public Health Advisory about loneliness and isolation. And the figure that's most striking to me, it's a little hard to see, but that green line in the bottom left is time spent with friends has decreased from the year 2003 to the year 2020 by about 20 hours a month on average. Average American is spending 20 hours less time a month with friends in 2020 than in 2023. So, what this is the last three slides reflect a situation in America today, and this is broadly reflected in many other parts of the developed world, in which we are more isolated, especially more isolated from the most impactful kinds of communities like marriage and like religious communities, certainly than our parents were, more than our grandparents were, more than most humans who've ever lived, to be honest. And this is somewhat alarming. This is real cause for concern. So I want to sort of widen the zoom. This is the second bit of the talk, and talk about our largest empirical project at the Human Flourishing Program at the moment, which is called the Global Flourishing Study. And it's going to help us sort of contextualize some of these America-specific trends that I've just been discussing. So the Global Flourishing Study is currently in its third year. It is, the design is pretty simple, deceptively simple. The idea is to survey the same roughly 208,000 people in 22 countries every year for 5 years. I say deceptively simple because that design means that Gallup, which is doing all the data collection, has to find the same 20,000 people in India every year, the same 15,000 people every year in Indonesia, which is not at all straightforward. So this is actually the largest longitudinal study that Gallup has ever done, by a very long shot, the largest it's ever done. It's sort of a moonshot project, in a lot of ways in the well-being science world. It's been very fun to be a part of it. And we ask these 208,000 people a series of about 100 questions about their lives every year. Ask them about how happy they feel, about how connected they feel to others. We ask them about their sense of belonging to their city and to their country. We ask them about whether their neighbors trust each other. We ask them about many aspects of their religious identity and participation. And what we found from looking at those data has been really surprising and very sobering. I want to introduce what we've learned from the Global Flourishing Study by way of contrast. Oh, I guess, yeah, sorry, I have this introductory slide. If you want to learn more, you can check out, there's been some very interesting news coverage of it. We've published now about 100 academic papers from this, the first year of data, as the analysis team for this project. Lots and lots of news coverage, so I encourage you to go do some Googling and sort of find out for yourself what we're up to. But yeah, I want to sort of contextualize what we've learned from the Global Flourishing Study by comparison with another prominent annual study of well-being globally. So there's this thing called the World Happiness Report that's published every March. It's going to be published next month. And even if you've never heard of this study, you've almost certainly been exposed at some level to its findings, because it is responsible, more than anything else, for the conceit that places like Finland and Denmark and Sweden are the happiest places in the world. So if you've ever read a news think piece about how Sweden is the happiest place in the world because of its welfare state, or the Danes are so happy because they have this culture of hygge. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but there's a whole book about it if you'd like to learn, about why it makes the Danes the happiest place in the world. Or, the Finns are the happiest place. The Finns are the happiest people in the world because they're all atheists. These are all real pieces you can go read. Whole books written on this topic. And the World Happiness Report is interesting for many reasons, but the thing that was most surprising to me when I started trying to understand more about this report and why it differed so much from what we were finding out in the Global Flourishing Study is that it's based on answers in about 160 countries to one question. And the question is about how your life is going as a whole. So the question is, think of a ladder with 11 rungs from 0 to 10, where the bottom rung is the worst possible life and the top rung is the best possible life. Where are you on that ladder from 0 to 10? And the thought is, and this is actually a pretty interesting thought, is that someone who's answering that question thoughtfully should think about absolutely every aspect of their life that matters to them. So our kind of working definition of flourishing as a state in which all aspects of your life are good should be tapped in principle by your answer to this question. If you spent a long time and thought very hard about your sense of meaning in life, your friendships, how satisfied you are with your work or how school's going, and you factored all of that in and distilled it into a number between 0 and 10, right? That would be your score, your life evaluation for the World Happiness Report. And if you rank the 160 countries in the World Happiness Report based on how their citizens respond to this question, you get something like this, right? Which is all the Scandinavian countries are always right at the top. Norway is the only one that's not Norway is the lowest ranking Scandinavian country, and it's number 7. And if you go down the list, it's sort of interesting. The top 50 or so countries consistently in the World Happiness Report tend to be dominated by countries in Europe, or its sort of colonial offshoots, places like the US or Australia. They tend to be pretty rich. They tend to have pretty generous welfare states, and all of this drives not just public interest, not just journalistic interest, but very serious policy interest. These people, the authors of this report go talk at the World Economic Forum, they talk to the World Bank about the kinds of policies that could inform a flourishing life, a happier world, helping us all to become more like Sweden and Finland and Denmark, right? That's the theory. So this is a very high stakes document, real world consequences. So let me show you what we found in the Global Flourishing Study. Our study is different, as I said, in a lot of ways. We have 22 countries. We actually have more people in the Global Flourishing Study than the World Happiness Report has. They have only about 1,000 people in each of the countries that they sample. And they don't follow the same people every year. It's different people every year. So the design is just different. But here's what wave 1 of the Global Flourishing Study looked like. So composite flourishing here is just a label for the average of responses in each of these countries to 12 questions, which cover 2 questions for each of those 6 domains I mentioned before. 2 questions for happiness and life satisfaction, 2 questions for meaning and purpose, 2 questions for health, 2 questions for character and virtue, 2 questions for relationships, and 2 for financial and material security, right? So if you average responses to those questions from 0 to 10 together, you get what we call composite flourishing. It's just an average of those 12, but it's combining information about a bunch of different aspects of life, right? And when you calculate composite flourishing for those 12 items, for the 22 countries in the Global Flourishing Study, you find that the surprise breakout winner, so to speak, of the Global Flourishing Study is Indonesia. So we have Sweden, you notice. I don't know if you can find Sweden on this list. Sweden is the one Scandinavian country in this sample. Sweden's composite flourishing score puts it in 13th place, behind the US, which is interesting, but even more interestingly, a lower composite flourishing score than we find reported in Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, Mexico, the Philippines, and Indonesia. The top half of the sort of top 11 countries, for this composite flourishing score in the Global Flourishing Study are not drawn principally from Western Europe and its colonial offshoots. All of those countries are on the bottom half of the rankings. And what I'm showing you here is an average that, it averages together scores for these different dimensions of flourishing, right? So it's also interesting, and if I had more time, which I don't, I could show you. We could go item by item, and what you'd see is that these differences are really driven by large gaps in the scores for items related to meaning and relationships and character that favor places like Indonesia and the Philippines and Mexico, those kinds of places, over against these sort of wealthier Western countries. Just to illustrate, this is my favorite sort of data point from this chart. Tanzania has a GDP per capita of about $1,100 per year, $1,100 per person per year. The US, actually I wanted to show you on the next, I think it's the next slide. This is a little hard to see, apologies. This is another graphic from a different Christianity Today article, but this just plots, each of these dots plots GDP per capita on the y-axis, the vertical axis, against the composite flourishing score on the x-axis. So you can see way at the top up there, that blue dot way high above the others is the US, GDP per capita, not adjusted for purchasing power parity if you care about these things, but just sort of the raw GDP per capita is about $82,000 per year in the US. And that gets us a composite flourishing score only slightly lower than Tanzania's at $1,100 per year. So there's a very slightly negative relationship between GDP and flourishing in the Global Flourishing Study. Now, there's lots of complications in comparing the countries in the sample, and I don't want to gloss over those prematurely. Maybe we can get into some of them in the Q&A. But we find that if you look at many, many aspects of flourishing, the same pattern seems to emerge. that there seems to be real deficits in these sort of richer, more humanistic aspects of a good life. Sense of meaning in life, sense of being deeply connected to others, a sense of showing love and care to others and acting to promote the good in places that have become very wealthy and very prosperous. And so I've showed you here this kind of all over the place relationship between GDP and flourishing, right? Now look at this one. Oh yeah, okay, so this is another indicator, right? Another question we ask in the GFS is, how often do you show love and care to others? Anyone else in your life? And again, this is a much more similar list, right, to composite flourishing, certainly than the one based on GDP. You find the Philippines and Indonesia again at the top, Mexico on the top 4. Once again, Japan way at the bottom, where it always seems to be for these outcomes. There's a complicated set of reasons why Japan has such low scores. Some of them have nothing to do probably with Japan actually being less happy. There's some evidence that East Asian respondents just prefer the middle of these kinds of scales. They see, a 9 or a 10 as being kind of boastful. So maybe 6 or 7 is like a better score actually. But even when you ask, one of the questions in the Global Flourishing Study is essentially, do you have a friend? Do you have anyone in your life you can count on? And the Japanese sample has by far the lowest percentage answering yes to that question of any country in the Global Flourishing Study. So there's a real signal here. And the signal seems to be that places that have richer, denser, deeper networks of loving relationships are happier. They're places where people have a greater sense of meaning in life, where they feel as though they are becoming a kind of person they can be proud of, they're living the sort of life that would be worth picking, And there is some evidence, and again, I don't want to short circuit a very complicated discussion about what's happening to us, say in the US or in the rest of the Western world, but it seems as though those places that have become, in the last couple of 100 years, very wealthy, relatively healthy, long-lived as a result of this complicated process of economic and cultural modernization, right, that has sort of made places like the US so different in so many ways from almost every human society that's ever existed before us, have also thinned out those communities that turn out to be the most important drivers of a flourishing life, thinned out those dense networks of religious communities, of family, nuclear and extended, of just friendship within communities that, for most people, are the most important driver of a good life. So I showed you before, this totally wacky, basically no relationship between GDP and flourishing. This is just my version of a very simple plot of composite flourishing and then showing love and care, those two scores. And there's a very strong correlation, the coefficient of correlation. I've shown you that line of best fit is 0.85, which is a very strong correlation between the two. It doesn't mean that one is causing the other, but it makes intuitive sense that these would hang together, and we do in fact see that in the first wave of the Global Flourishing Study data. Okay, and I mean, so, what do we think about this? What does it mean that, places like Indonesia have higher composite flourishing, higher in meaning, higher in these character outcomes and relationship satisfaction? One sort of resource that I keep coming back to as I try to interpret the Global Flourishing Study data is evidence from another really remarkable longitudinal study of well-being that's run out of Harvard. That's called the Grant Study of Adult Development. And it was started at Harvard University in the 1930s, I believe, 1936, I think, although don't hold me to that start date. Researchers recruited 265, I believe, Harvard undergraduates to be enrolled in a study where they would be followed over the course of their lives. About 10 years in, the same researchers added a cohort of African-American men from Boston. As it happened, Harvard undergraduates in the 1930s were pretty much all white, right? So that was who was represented in that initial cohort. Interestingly, the Grant study originally included John F. Kennedy. He was what in the trade we call lost to follow-up, of course, sadly, in the 1960s. But over time, they followed these men and their wives and their kids and grandkids over about 80 years. Jonathan's waving at me. 2 minutes. Okay, great. Gosh. Well, okay. I've run out of time. Alas. And what they found, Bob Waldinger, who's pictured there with his wife, who's just a lovely man at Harvard, he often says when he talks about his work in the Grant study that what they find consistently is that happiness is love, full stop. He says that the people who report the best lives, not just in terms of their subjective well-being, but also in terms of their physical health, are the ones who have leaned most fully into lives of loving relationships, dense, overlapping networks of loving relationships. Now, I have lamentably sort of given short shrift to the last bit of this talk, which I am not going to do full justice to. But I wanted to conclude with a kind of brief theological coda. I'm a theologian by training, as I said before, old books and dead languages, that sort of thing. And this is one take. So why is it that we find that the people who are most deeply embedded in loving relationships all around the world are those who report the highest degree of flourishing? If you're a Christian, as I am, and I know some of you here tonight are, one intuitive way of explaining this is that love goes to the very bottom of things in a way that nothing else about our lives does. The first epistle of John in the New Testament includes a really remarkable statement in its 4th chapter. John, let's just call him John, whoever wrote this wonderful epistle, he says that God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. Now, this might seem like a trite statement to you if you've grown up hearing it in churches and maybe seeing it on bumper stickers, that sort of thing, but it's important to realize that John is probably the first person ever to write this down. I mean, like in the history of our species, as far as we're aware of. It is an unbelievable statement. Now, we could spend a whole semester, we could spend a lifetime, you should spend a lifetime trying to understand what this means, But one way of thinking about it, this is a sort of one way this gets taken up in the Christian tradition, is that God is love because love wills the good of the other. That's what it is at bottom. This is what Thomas Aquinas says. Love is seeing the other and saying, you are good. It's good that you exist. I want to help you be the best kind of thing that you can be. I want to enjoy the fact that you exist together with you. And what God does for us in creation is precisely because God creates out of nothing. He doesn't need anything else to bring us into being. He doesn't depend on anything that isn't God to create. He wills the good that we are in every moment. That's what it means to be a creature of God. What it means to be created is for God to know the good that you could be and to will you to exist. He doesn't need anything else at all for you to exist. And so you can verify right now, experientially, that God loves you because you exist. Right now, what's happening in this room at this moment is that God is knowing and willing the good that you are. You would not exist if that weren't so. So deep down in the very marrow of things is the fact that God is love. And so the one who lives in love, the one who embraces a life of loving others, even as Jesus did at great cost, right? Even at the cost of laying down your life for others. And this is actually where I wanted to end, although we'll have to kind of skip over most of it. The one who lives in love is becoming not just God-like, but the one who, to the extent to which your life is filled up with love, the extent to which your life is pervaded by love, shaped by it, you are being assimilated to the very thing that God is, deep down. This is what it means. The Christian tradition, there's a long tradition within Christian theology of talking about our vocation ultimately is not just to be saved, not just to be holy, but to become united to God, participating in God, to become God in the sort of fullest, richest sense. And what that means ultimately is nothing other than to become love right through, even at great cost, even when it means laying down your life as did Jesus. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm probably over time now, so Jonathan, should I? Yeah, should we? But there's lots to be said here. I mean, I hope that I've piqued your interest with some of these comments about the global flourishing study and this sort of theological coda. So I'm eager to have a conversation about anything that I've said and anything that's on your mind. Thank you, guys. Oh, yeah, we have to go over to. And I think you can use the QR code here if you would like to submit a question. I believe that's how that works.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Vernon Case. Can we please give him another round of applause, please?
Thank you, guys.
Well, once again, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and engaging talk on the perspective of a Christian perspective of generosity and love, as well as our personal human flourishing. To kind of explore some of these ideas a little bit further, I would love to kind of get your thoughts on just kind of speaking on some practical ways in which we can do so as college students now to attend to our well-being in this season of life.
That's great. Sure. Well, so I've said a couple of times today, I feel like I'm always saying this, as I've talked to different groups, that what we at the Human Flourishing Program do is really wholesale research, meaning what I've told you about is what some practices, some institutions that make for a flourishing life on average, in general, for most people. So in general, the differences, say, between people who attend religious services every week and those who don't are pretty significant, in terms of how happy they feel, how healthy they are. That does not mean that there aren't tons of people who go to church every week who are miserable in spite of it or even because of it, and plenty of people who never darken the door of a church or synagogue or mosque who have wonderful lives and are lovely people. We all know people, right, of both kinds. So, I'm always a little hesitant to offer specific advice, even to a group as big as this, because I'm conscious of the fact that what works on average will not work in the lives of a considerable number of people who are listening to me, right? So not knowing you as the questioner, or any of you in the audience, not knowing your stories or your background, or all of the many sort of wonderful idiosyncrasies that make you who you are and make you tick, I do think that, in general, here's what I would say. Invest in loving relationships at every stage, in every moment. But certainly as you think about the long term, about, sort of what you build your life around, the kind of work you do, where you move, I think there's a real temptation, and I'm to some extent, I embody this in a lot of ways in my own life, for young people today to sort of prioritize professional advancement, to prioritize, entering into careers where they can make as much money as possible. Often this means moving a lot. I have moved a lot in the course of my short adult life thus far, moving far from family, delaying investing in marriage, withdrawing from other kinds of communities as you prioritize, pursuing these important goals, and I think that's a temptation that we're all subject to, I think everyone feels that pressure, it's anytime you're sacrificing love for the sake of anything else, you're making a bad bargain. This is what I would say. So I don't have specific advice necessarily for you about, the kinds of communities or relationships you should lean into. I do think for the huge percentage of the American public that are religious believers of one stripe or another, it's about 50% of the population that is like notionally affiliated with some religious tradition but doesn't participate on a regular basis in the life of that tradition. I hope that the kind of work that we as a program do can constitute a sort of invitation to reconsider, whether coming back to church or synagogue or whatever, is might be good for you. I know there are lots of reasons that people who don't attend religious services don't, but these really are powerful institutions. But I think, even beyond that, beyond the specific question of what you do, I think just looking for ways to prioritize deep friendships, lasting friendships, thick ties, not friendships that you form not friendships you form online on the basis of really superficial common interests or, highly curated posture, but deep, authentic friendships are by far the most important thing you can do at any stage of life, but maybe especially now as you're thinking about launching into adulthood.
And in light of that hope of returning to those thicker ties of friendship and companionship, what do you believe keeps people, in light of the supporting data of both the Human Flourishing Project and correlational studies, what do you believe keeps people from turning to the love of others and fellowship of others?
Well, there's no one answer to this question. It really depends, I suppose, on the kind of community you have in mind. There's some evidence, for instance, that the gradual repeal all across the West, really, in the last 50 years or so, of laws that mandated that businesses stay closed on Sundays has had a pretty profound effect on keeping people out of churches or making it easier for people not to go to church. I mean, there's some interesting empirical work that's been done on this. But for religious communities, a huge factor here is just that more and more people, in fact, don't believe in any particular religion, right? I mean, there's more and more people just identifying as religious nuns, as they're called. They have no religious affiliation. A lot of factors behind that. So I mean, this is a question about religious communities in particular. Why are we lonelier in general? More isolated in general. I mean, this is in a way the question behind this question is, where did the modern world come from? How did we get here? What is it that brought about this strange way of living in which we're so wealthy but also so lonely? There are many books on this issue. Some of them blame philosophers like René Descartes, or theologians like Martin Luther. I'm mostly not persuaded by those kinds of accounts. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer, and I also don't think that the solution, to the problems that we face is to try to recreate, some imagined, lost world that we think was so wonderful, whether that was in the 1950s or the 1350s or whatever. I think the challenge for us today is hopefully without having to give up, the many goods that come from living in societies like America. I mean, I certainly don't want to live in a world without anesthesia, for instance. I'm very grateful for Novocaine. That's a really important part of my life, But are there ways that we can try to retrieve some of those goods that we've maybe traded off as a society in the last several generations? So is there a way to hold on to the good things about our lives today, but also lean in a new way to community, to friendship, to deep loving relationships? So that's a little bit of an evasive answer, but I think that the answer for any particular question is it's really complicated, actually. But the most practical thing, I think, in the face of all of that is just what can we do today to sort of reinvest and recommit to community.
And in a pursuit of defining our terms, how would you define happiness in light of the Christian life?
Yeah, in light of the Christian life. I mean, I do think that I think this definition that I mentioned at the top, flourishing as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, is actually a pretty good definition in Christian terms too. I mean, this is the thing I would emphasize in Christian perspective is that the fact that a good life is a life in which all aspects of a person's life are good underscores why it's impossible to have a fully flourishing life here below in this vale of tears, as Augustine called it. For one thing, if you think of just physical health, right, as an element of your flourishing, I'm sorry to tell you, but you are going to die, barring the Lord's return suddenly, on his own timetable. Your physical health is a finite quantity, which is diminishing. It's hard to believe, I know, if you're 20 or 22, but time and chance happens to us all, and you too will one day, begin to feel your joints creak, and things stop working. So until we live in a world that's not shadowed by the fear of death, until we live in a world that's not rent by violence, and by suspicion and by hatred, flourishing is always going to be something that we only attain in part. We only ever enjoy in very fragmentary and fleeting ways. And so, I would say Christians can and should embrace this way of thinking about flourishing as a state in which all aspects of your life are good. We're actually in a position to say, yes, 100%. That's why we need Jesus. That's why we need the resurrection. That's why we need the hope of a world in which every tear will be wiped away, as Revelation says, right? So, yes, I mean, there's more to be said about this, obviously. I mean, particularly one thing that I think is very important to recognize is that under the conditions of death and sin in which we live today, what a life of flourishing looks like for you and me now very often looks like a life of bearing crosses. It's a life like Jesus, spent in giving away yourself to others, laying down your own pride, your own preferences. So a good life for us right now very often looks like suffering for the good. It looks like suffering for the sake of those you love, suffering for the sake of the truth. And that's not maybe that sounds paradoxical, but I think that's just, in a sense, the pursuit of any and every good. Anything and everything that really matters in life comes in and through some kind of suffering. It's something that we win over time from enduring adversity, and to become the kind of person that we can genuinely be proud of being, that those around us can genuinely sort of rejoice with. But anyway, there's more to say about that. But yeah, I guess that would be my take.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for allowing us to and engaging us in a deeper and more intentional seeking of our pursuit for others and our pursuit for a flourishing life. Can we please give another round of applause to Dr. Brennan Case?
Thank you.
Well, students, please feel free to come up and talk to Dr. Brennan Case afterwards.
Yeah.
If you were not able to have your question answered, thank you so much for your questions. Please feel free to get some refreshments on your way out. Please remember to check out for the CE credit, and also feel free to join us on Sunday night for our weekly college church services. Love you and have a great rest of your night.